Welcome back to Inhibition. Today's topic, abortion. Is it a woman's right or is it murder? We're going to break down the science and break down the evidence. I think it's time we talk about it. Alright, welcome back to the channel. We're going to jump into the topic, but before we do, we post videos every single week related to politics, religion, and things in the news. So if you're interested, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss a video. Let's jump into this. So with abortion, we're going to break down the science, we're going to break down the information. Abortion right now is a very important topic to the Supreme Court. They are actually looking to hear cases related to Roe V Wade, and we are going to break down some basic information about abortion. And one of the first things we're going to start with is it a constitutional right? A lot of people believe that abortion is a constitutional right that comes from the Roe V Wade decision, and we're going to break that down and see if this is indeed a constitutional right. You can see here that the Democrats tweeted, "Abortion is a constitutional right. We're not going to let any anti-choice legislator change that. Abortion must stay a constitutional right." The Denver Post said, "Donald Trump's Supreme Court is preparing to dismantle the constitutional right to a safe and legal abortion." You can see here that someone said, no, abortion is a constitutional right in all 50 states, kiddo. You don't get to force people to gestate or give birth against their will. Here we have someone saying access to abortion is more vulnerable than it has been since the constitutional right was won in Roe v. Wade. Someone said here, Roe is hanging by a thread and so many do not have access to abortion despite it being a constitutional right. Opening the door even slightly to considering new restrictions could put care out of reach for huge swaths of the U.S. Abortion is essential. And then finally someone said, nah, people can have 15 abortions and then decide to have kids the 16th time they get impregnated. No issues with it. Abortion is awesome and a God-given constitutional right. This person not only said abortion is a constitutional right, they said it is a God-given right. There is this belief that abortion is guaranteed by the Constitution and it is a right along the same lines as freedom of speech or the right to keep and bear arms. Is that really in the Constitution though? Where does this come from? Well, it all started back in the 60s. The 1960s in America, there was this large push for social change. And we can see there were some good things like the civil rights of the 1960s where we got rid of Jim Crow laws and laws that legislated discrimination. That was a good thing. And so there was some good social change in the 1960s. There were also things that weren't so good. You had the sexual revolution that happened in the 1960s. And this was a big push towards sexual promiscuity, a big push towards all kinds of sexual perversion. And it was a big push in the 60s. There were other things like the hippie movement that kind of went along with that. And it was this fighting the man mentality, this rebel against the system mentality. And then you had some good things. You had the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement was actually a really good thing in the 1960s where large numbers of people started getting saved and coming to Jesus. That's a great thing. Then you had a shift in music, and then you had feminism. And feminism was a good thing and a bad thing all in one. There is absolutely a great part of feminism. Women are equal. Women are absolutely equal to men and should be treated as such. That being said, with push for feminism came the push for abortion. And this started in the 60s. A lot of people think that in Roe v. Wade, that's when abortion became legal in the United States. But actually, abortion was already legal in much of the country before Roe v. Wade. It was a state's issue. So at the time, prior to the Roe v. Wade case, states could make their own laws regarding abortion. And some states allowed it, some states did not. Some states allowed it at different varying degrees, but it was a state issue. So there was abortion, and there was a big push for abortion in the 60s that led into the 70s. So with Roe v. Wade, what happened with Roe v. Wade? That's the big case that people are saying established a constitutional right to an abortion. abortion. So let's talk about Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade came from a woman named Norma McCorvey. That's where it started. She was a pregnant 22-year-old single woman in Texas. Pregnant 22-year-old single. She already actually had a couple of kids, another kid. She was single, 22 years old, not very established, poor, did not have what she needed to continue to care for another child. And so she actually looked to get an abortion. But Texas had some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, reserving abortion only for when the mother's life would be in danger. She could not have an abortion. Now, Norma wanted to get an abortion, but because it was illegal, she couldn't. And she was talking to people about it, trying to figure out ways. She actually tried to go to a couple of underground abortion clinics or things that were illegal. She tried to get connected with people, trying to figure out a way to have an abortion. Well, in the process of looking for that, someone referred her to lawyers who were already preparing a case to take to court against the abortion laws in Texas. But they were looking for a plaintiff who was pregnant. They were looking for someone they could have on the lawsuit that wouldn't, obviously, they're just lawyers. They needed a plaintiff, someone who was being wronged, in their opinion, by this law, and it needed to be a pregnant woman. Well, somebody referred Norma to them. The two lawyers were Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington. These are the two lawyers that handled the case. Now, it's very important to understand they were already preparing this case. They were just looking for someone that they could put a name on the case, a face on the case. They were looking for someone that they could use to get the case pushed into court. Now, I point that out because what you learn about Norman, and we'll go into her big story in another video. I'm going to actually do a video down the line on her specifically. But Norma was very poor, uneducated. She was just looking to get an abortion. She was just looking for someone she thought could help her. And these two women exploited that. They actually used her. And what do I mean they used her? They didn't even take her to the court case. She was not there when they argued the arguments. They didn't even tell her when Roe v. Wade was won in the Supreme Court. They didn't even tell her that it had been won. She read about it in a newspaper hours later. So she did not even know that the case had been won, and it was her case. These two women did not care a thing about Norma. All they cared about was finding someone they could use, in Norma's own words, as a scapegoat or a sacrificial lamb that they could throw out there and use her name to get the case into the court. These women didn't care about women, and this is the very important part. Norma was someone who supposedly pro-abortion activists care about, because it's all about the woman, and we need to care about these women who are in these tough situations that need to feel like they need to have abortions. We need to care about them. But in reality, these two pro-abortion activists did not care about the woman. They cared about the case. That's it. They overlooked her. And that is a big part of her story. If you don't know, Norma actually ended up later in her life getting saved and becoming a Christian. And when she became a Christian, she actually realized how horrible abortion was and what she had done. And she spent the rest of her life until she passed away fighting to see Roe v. Wade overturned. And that was the woman who became known as Jane Roe. So these women didn't care about her, and she wrote a book about it. She admitted she's the one who said they didn't care about her. And that's very important to understand, that people who claim to be pro-abortion activists because they care about women, many times they actually don't. They care about abortion, but they don't care about the women behind it. Keep that in mind as we move forward. So what happened with Roe v. Wade? Well, the lawyers had Norma sign an affidavit with the pseudonym Jane Roe. That's where the Roe in Roe v. Wade comes from. And from there, they filed a case against Henry Wade. That's where the Wade comes from Roe v. Wade. They filed a case against Henry Wade, who was the district attorney for Dallas County, Texas. The district court stated that the abortion ban was unconstitutional, but they refused to file an injunction. So the district court in Texas explicitly stated, yes, we agree with the lawyers that this is an unconstitutional law in Texas. However, we're not going to file an injunction. Now, you may not know what an injunction is, but an injunction is a court order by which an individual is required to perform or is restrained from performing a particular act. In other words, the court did not file an injunction against Henry Wade or the state of Texas saying that they were restrained from enforcing this law that they have said is unconstitutional. And therefore, that wasn't good enough. Basically, according to the lawyers, Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey, she did not have anything, like, it didn't help her. Winning the case and saying it was unconstitutional didn't help her get the abortion because they did not file the injunction. So the lawyers decided to take the case case to the Supreme Court, which they ended up doing. Now, we'll go into the arguments in just a moment of what they argued and what the decision was in the Supreme Court. But during this entire case, Norma McCorvey ended up, while they were waiting on it to go to the Supreme Court, and it takes time, while they were waiting on that, Norma McCorvey ended up giving birth to her child, and she put that child up for adoption. So it's important to realize she didn't actually even have an abortion because it took too much time. Now, what's interesting, she writes in her book that these lawyers, one of these lawyers, Sarah Weddington, she had had an abortion herself, and she knew of a place that you could go to have it done, and she did not refer Norma there. Now, if she really believed that abortion was actually good for the woman and she cared for the woman, then why didn't she refer Jane Roe to have that abortion? Because she needed, and this is Norma McCorvey's own words, she needed someone who was pregnant. She wanted her to stay pregnant. She did not want her to have the abortion, because if she just had the abortion anyway through other means, then it would hurt her case. So clearly she didn't care. If she really thinks abortion was caring for women, she clearly didn't care enough for Jane Roe. Now, I'm not saying she should have. I am glad that she didn't have that abortion, because that child was able to be born and live a healthy life afterwards. But again, this goes to the thinking of the lawyers who supposedly think that abortion is a good thing for women and that it's the caring thing for women, but they did not care about Norma McCorvey. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about helping the woman in need here. But let's talk about the Roe v. Wade case. Let's break this down piece by piece. What were the arguments that were made? Well, for the state of Texas, which is Wade, Henry Wade, the district attorney, this was the case that was made on the state of Texas side. First, they argued that states have an interest in safeguarding health, maintaining medical standards, and protecting prenatal life. That is absolutely a good argument. States do have an interest in safeguarding health and maintaining those medical standards and protecting human life. That is a huge part of the state's job. Now, it doesn't mean the state needs to run healthcare, but it does mean there needs to be standards in place to protect life. They also argued that a fetus is a person protected by the 14th Amendment. Now, we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment in just a minute, and we're also going to talk about, is the fetus a person? We're going to break that down in just a moment. But they argued a fetus is a person protected by the 14th Amendment. And finally, they argued that protecting prenatal life from the time of conception is a compelling state interest. That from the time of conception, it is important to the state to protect that life, because citizens being born into the United States who could then grow and be a part of society is important to the state. That was Wade's argument. Now, what about Jane Roe's argument? What about the argument of these two particular lawyers? So the argument on the Roe side was that the Texas law invaded an individual's right to liberty under the 14th Amendment. So both sides argued based on the 14th Amendment. On the Roe side, they said that an individual has a right to liberty, and that was invaded by the Texas law. It also argued that the Texas law infringed on women's rights to marital, familial, and sexual privacy guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. So it was a violation of privacy. And finally, they argued that the right to an abortion is absolute. Women are entitled to end a pregnancy at any time, for any reason, in any way they choose. That's the argument that they made. So what was the decision? What did it come down to? After all the arguments were made, how did the court rule? Well, the decision came down in a 7-2 ruling that the abortion ban in Texas was unconstitutional. Basically, they said a woman's right to an abortion falls within the right to privacy as protected by the 14th Amendment. However, while the decision gave women autonomy during the first trimester of pregnancy, there were different levels of state interest for the second and third trimesters that were allowed. In other words, during the first trimester, women can do whatever they want. During the second and third trimester, it's okay to have some rules regarding abortion. That was their case. Now, here's what they argued. First trimester, the state, that is any government, could treat abortion only as a medical decision, leaving medical judgment to the woman's physician. In the second trimester, they came in and said the state's interest was seen as legitimate when it was protecting the health of the mother. And then the third trimester, it says that after the viability of the fetus, the potential of human life could be considered as a legitimate state interest. The state could choose to regulate or even prescribe abortion as long as the life and health of the mother were protected. So basically saying that in that third trimester, you can ban abortion outright except for in cases of life of the mother, and that was the decision of Roe v. Wade. But first trimester, you couldn't ban at all. Second trimester, you could have some rules. That was the argument from Roe, or the decision from Roe v. Wade. So they argued this based on the 14th Amendment. So let's look at what the 14th Amendment says. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges, or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, when you first read this, you might be thinking, well, I don't see anything about abortion. How did they get abortion out of the 14th Amendment? Doesn't say anything about abortion, doesn't even address anything close to abortion. So where did they draw this from? Well, it was in this phrase right here, nor shall any state deprive any person of, they skip the word life, which is interesting, and jump to the word liberty. Nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty without due process of the law. So they skip life. Now, if this child in the womb is a person, then it says you can't deprive them of life. But they did not agree with the concept that the child in the womb was a person, and therefore they focused only on the woman and said the woman is a person and you can't deprive her of liberty without due process of the law. So this was the basis of the argument. They said liberty includes privacy. I agree with that statement. Liberty, in order to have true freedom, there has to be an aspect of privacy. If the government is constantly involved in my private life, I am not really free. So I agree with the concept that liberty includes privacy. To an extent, that doesn't mean that everything you do is private, correct? Like, I can't go and murder someone and then claim, oh, it's privacy, you can't say anything about it. No, of course not. So not everything you do falls under the context of privacy. But there is an aspect of liberty, including privacy, that's important. From there, we also know privacy includes medical decisions. That they argued that, and that's absolutely true. Your medical decisions that you make between you and your doctor should have the government completely non-involved. It should be you and your doctor's decision when it's a medical decision, and that I completely agree with that. I do not want the government getting involved in my health care. But then from there, this is where things went off the rails. They went from privacy includes medical decisions to medical decisions include abortions. Medical decisions do not include abortions. That's something that they just asserted. And they assert this because you can have an abortion done by a medical professional, therefore it must be a medical decision. But I could also go to a medical professional and talk to them, called a psychologist, and talk to them about feelings of rage and murderous intent that I might have. That doesn't mean that the action of murder is a medical decision just because I talk to a medical professional about it. But people will make the argument that it is a medical decision, and since medical decisions are involved in privacy, and privacy is involved in liberty, that means liberty therefore includes abortions, and therefore you cannot deprive women of an abortion without due process of the law. That's the logic or the argument from the 14th Amendment in Roe v Wade. It is a terrible argument, but that is the argument that the court went with. Now, it's a terrible argument, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. This isn't just my opinion that this is a terrible argument. There are constitutional scholars who agree this is a terrible argument. For example, a constitutional scholar and Yale law professor, John Hart Ely, who, by the way, personally supports legalized abortion, okay? He wasn't anti-abortion. He actually supported abortion being legal, but he did not support the way it was done under Roe v Wade. He said, what is frightening about Roe is that this super protected right is not inferable from the language of the Constitution, the framers' thinking respecting the specific problem and issue, or any general value derivable from the provisions they included, or not even the nation's governmental structure. It is bad because it is bad constitutional law, or rather, because it's not constitutional law and gives almost no sense of any obligation to try to be. In other words, he's saying that the decision that Roe v. Wade came to, the way they argued and the way they came to their decision is bad constitutional, or really not even constitutional law at all. There's nothing in the way the language of the Constitution is written, in the thinking of the framers of the Constitution, in any value derivable from the provisions in the Constitution, or even the governmental structure that would say that the decision of abortion being legal under the 14th Amendment was right. And again, this is someone who supports abortion. They're not pro-life, they support abortion, but they made this observation about the law itself. Or what about Edward Lazarus? Now, Edward Lazarus was a former Blackmun clerk. Now, Blackmun was the justice who wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade, and this was one of his clerks. His own words said he was utterly committed to legalized abortion. Again, it's not a pro-life person, so they're not just saying this because they're pro-life. This is someone who supported abortion, but this is the statement he made. Indeed, as a matter of constitutional interpretation and judicial method, Roe borders on indefensible indefensible. Justice Blackmun's opinion provides essentially no reasoning in support of its holding. And in the years since Roe's announcement, no one has produced a convincing defense of Roe on its own terms. In other words, there is no way that this decision was made based on any logical interpretation of the 14th Amendment. This is bad constitutional law. Justice William Rehnquist, who was the one who wrote the dissenting opinion from the court when Roe v. Wade was written, he said, to reach its result, the court necessarily has to find within the scope of the 14th Amendment a right that was apparently completely unknown to the drafters of the amendment. In other words, Justice Rehnquist was saying there's nothing in the 14th Amendment that would even imply this, and we know that the people who wrote the 14th Amendment would not have implied this. This has nothing to do with the 14th Amendment. It's an abuse of the Constitution, which basically means there is no actual constitutional right to an abortion. Now, I know the court has said there is, which is why some people argue, yes, we won the constitutional right. No, you did not win a constitutional right. The Constitution does not give you that right. The court tried to give you that right based on a flawed interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And that isn't just my opinion. Again, that's the opinion of legal experts and constitutional scholars who even support abortion. Now, I know what you're thinking. Whoa, 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 whoa. You're a man. No men are allowed. You can't talk on this topic. You need to sit down and be quiet and let women handle this. Don't try to tell women what to do. You're a man. Sit down. This is the faux feminism. There was an aspect of feminism in the 60s that was good, that was a fight for women to be equal and treated as such to men. And that's a good thing. Feminism recently has devolved from equality to I am going to push a man down to make myself feel higher. And that is not feminism. That is just man-hating, and it's an absolute perversion. Now, that being said, people have used that to argue against any man that speaks up against abortion. You're a man. You're not allowed to talk about that. The problem with that, it's terrible logic. The validity and truth of an argument stands and falls on its own, regardless of whose lips the argument comes from. It's illogical to base the validity of an argument on who said it, or to say because you said it, it's not valid. That's illogical. It doesn't matter who makes the argument. The argument stands and falls on its own. If I, as an adult, were to say that the sky is made of gumdrops, and my child, who is a child, says no, the sky is not made of gumdrops, one of those arguments is true. One of them is false. Mine is not true, saying it's made of gumdrops just because I am an adult. And the argument that my child made that it's not made of gumdrops is not false just because they are a child. The argument stands or falls on its own, regardless of who made the argument. So to say that men can't have an opinion on this just because they are men is illogical. It is very, by definition, fundamentally flawed. On top of that, you don't have to be personally affected by a situation to be able to think rationally, logically, and morally on the topic. Well, first of all, there are men who have been personally affected by abortion. Just because the man didn't have the abortion doesn't mean there aren't men who've had spouses and girlfriends and family who have had abortions and who have been affected by that. So yes, abortion does affect men, contrary to what fake feminism will tell you. But on top of that, even if abortion has not affected a man, that does not mean that the man doesn't have the ability to speak up on the topic. A man can think rationally, logically, and morally on the topic, even if they have not encountered the situation. And to prove this, women who say this claim, the feminists who claim that men can't have an opinion on this, they are actually illogical and hypocritical, because it was men who passed Roe v. Wade. They did not have a problem with men having an opinion on this topic when the opinion aligned with their opinion. Take, for example, politicians. When a politician has an opinion on abortion, if that politician is a man, but they agree with the women on abortion, the women have no problem with the man voicing their agreement. It is only when a man dares to disagree that it becomes a problem. So again, this isn't an issue of who says the argument. It is the argument on its own that has to be evaluated. You don't have to be personally affected. It was men who gave women the right to vote. Now, men had the right to vote, so they weren't personally affected by this, yet they voted to give women the right to vote. What about the fact that it was white men who abolished slavery? Could they not have an opinion and not abolish slavery because, they're not black and they weren't going through it? Of course not. Again, it has nothing to do with who you are as a person for you to be able to make an argument based on rationality, logic, and morality. You have to weigh each claim regardless of who says this. This also ignores a very basic fact that the pro-life movement's not all men. Actually, about 80% of all pro-life activists are women. Women fight for pro-life causes. This isn't just a bunch of men trying to control women. Women actually support pro-life. So this kind of leads us into an argument that people who support pro-life, whether it be men or women, they just want to control women's bodies. They just want to have control over women. Now, this is a fundamentally flawed argument for two reasons. Number one, there's another body we're concerned with, right? No one cares if a woman takes out her appendix. We don't care if you get a tattoo or you pierce your ears or you do something crazy to your body. We don't care. It's not about your body. There's another body that we're concerned with. That being said, there's also the understanding that everybody's body is controlled. In our society, every single person in this country, your body is controlled to one extent or another. And we're going to look at that and explain that in just a moment. But first, let's address this idea that there's another body we're concerned with. So some people try to say that the fetus inside the mother's womb is a part of the woman's body. It's the woman's body. You know, stay out of my uterus, which again, we don't really care about your uterus as much as we care about what's in your uterus. But they argue it's my uterus, it's my body, and this fetus is just a clump of cells in my body. We'll deal with the clump of cells argument in a moment. But let's just see, is this actually a part of the woman's body? Is a fetus a part of the woman's body? Well, first of all, mothers are female by definition, right? Women, females, give birth, but about half of their children are male. Now, how can a human being be both male and a female? If it's her body and she is female, then how could that fetus not be female, right? This is fundamental biology. It is not a part of the woman's body. What about the fact that they can have different blood types? The fetus can have a different blood type from the mother. How is that her body? Her body has this blood type. This has a completely different blood type. How does that work? It's not her body. What about the fact that the baby can be a different race from the mother? A completely different race depending on the father, right? How does that work? It's not her body. As a matter of fact, every cell in the mother's body has a set of chromosomal characteristics that are entirely distinct from every cell in the baby's body. So again, completely different chromosomal characteristics, completely different genetic code. They have completely different DNA strands. The baby's DNA is 100% distinct from the mother's DNA. It's not her body. As a matter of fact, this is interesting. When an unborn child anchors to the uterine wall, which happens just a little bit after conception, there's actually a concerted attack by white blood cells to defeat the child, and the child actually defends itself against those white blood cells. This is the mother's immune system recognizing that that baby is non-self. It's not a part of the woman's body, and therefore it's got to be eradicated. That's the initial response of a woman's body. When you get some kind of foreign body, say a virus or something that doesn't belong to you, something that's not your body, into your body, your immune system sends white blood cells to actually attack that thing and try to eradicate it. It's part of your immune system. That actually happens initially when the baby first joins to the uterus. That is actually a very key factor in realizing that even the woman's body knows this is a foreign body. It's not the woman's body. It's something different. Now, the natural processes of the body end up, once the baby attaches and goes there, it ends up fighting against that, and okay, it's fine because God created us that way, but initially the woman's body wants to reject that baby. It's not the woman's body. The baby can actually die without the mother dying, and the mother can actually die without the baby dying. So how is that her body? If she's dead and it's her body, then the baby would be dead. But it actually does happen where the mother can die and the baby still be alive. It's a different body. The unborn baby actually initiates a process that culminates in its leaving the mother's body. Name another body organ that does that. Does the woman's heart start a process when it starts beating where it's going to eventually leave in a few months her body? Of course not. This is not her body. It is another body. Now, we've established the baby is another body, and that's what we're concerned with. Now, keeping that in mind, now we have the issue of the fact that everybody's body, everyone's body is controlled to an extent. Everyone in America, it's controlled to an extent. For example, I cannot use my trigger finger to shoot someone in the head. My body, my hand is controlled by the government to say that I cannot use my hand holding a gun, using my finger to pull the trigger and kill an innocent person. My body's controlled. I can't use my body to steal someone else's things. I can't run full speed ahead using my body, wrap my hand around some woman's purse and yank it and steal it. Can't do that. It's a crime. My body is being being controlled. Someone can't use their body to rape another person. Your body is being controlled. There's a reason for that. What is the principle behind our body being controlled? Very simple. You don't get to use your body to intentionally harm another body. Your body cannot be used to harm someone else's body who's innocent. That's the end of it. That's the principle. We have that principle in our current laws in America. Why is abortion suddenly different? You don't get to use your body to harm another innocent body. Now, this leads to another argument. Well, people say, well, yeah, say it's another body, but in reality, it's just a clump of cells. It's not actually a human life. It's not actually a human being. It's just a clump of cells. At least early on, it's just a clump of cells. And that's a common argument you're going to hear. The argument is basically that a fetus is not a human life, just a clump of cells or a ball of cells. Some people try to use the word it's a parasite. People use different words to describe this, but they're basically saying it's not a human life. But here's the thing. A clump of cells doesn't grow into an adult human being. If left alone, that clump of cells that people are referring to will continue to grow and ultimately become an adult human being. A random clump of cells does not do that. So, for example, there are cells all over your body. Take the cells on the back of your hand, your skin cells. They're a part of you, but they, along with, say, a sperm cell and an egg, are different from an embryo, which is a whole living organism that will mature into adulthood. If I take the cells on the back of my hand and I stare at it long enough, it's never going to grow from living skin cells on my hand to somehow become a human adult. But an embryo does. It's an organism, not just a clump of cells. Dr. Maureen Kondik, who's the assistant professor of neurobiology and anatomy at the University of Utah, states there's a fundamental difference between a clump of living cells and an organism like an adult or an unborn child. She goes on to explain that even dead bodies for a time actually contain clumps of living cells that continue to function. And this is what she says: cellular life may continue for some time following the loss of integrated bodily function, but once the ability to act in a coordinated manner has been lost, life cannot be restored to a corpse, no matter how alive the cells composing the body may yet be. But then she says this: a human embryo is vastly different than a corpse composed of clumps of cells. Embryos are not merely collections of human cells. Like a corpse, when you die and you're no longer a living human being, you may still have living cells operating in your body, but those clumps of cells are not going to grow and make you come back to life. It's not a life. It's just cells that are eventually going to die out. But embryos are not merely collections of human cells, but living creatures with all the properties that define any organism as distinct from a group of cells. Embryos are capable of growing, maturing, maintaining a physiologic balance between various organ systems, adapting to changing circumstances, and repairing injury. Mere groups of human cells do nothing like this under any circumstances. It's not just a random group of cells. Dr. Kondik goes on and says, early human embryos are often described as merely a ball of cells, or for many, it is difficult to imagine that something that looks more like a bag of marbles in the very beginning than a baby could possibly be a human being. Fundamentally, the argument asserts that human life is worthy of respect depending on appearance. When plainly stated, this conclusion is quite disturbing and also quite problematic. What level of malformation are we willing to accept before we revoke the right to continued existence? In other words, if you just claim that you can kill that embryo in the early stages because it doesn't look like a human being, you're basing it solely on looks and not on actual science, which clearly shows it is a living human organism. So because you're basing it on looks alone, if that's the standard, then what happens when something doesn't look the way we think humans should look? We just get to kill it? It's a very scary thought. What does the science actually say? Well, first of all, the newly fertilized egg, so at conception, it's a distinct and living organism from that moment. It contains a staggering amount of genetic information sufficient to control the individual's growth and development for his or her entire lifetime. Right from the moment of conception, the DNA that grows and develops right there at conception in a newly fertilized egg is enough DNA and genetic information to be able to sustain that little embryo through its entire life, all the way until they pass away late in old age. Nothing is created from that genetic code after that. They have a full genetic code of a human being as an embryo at conception. A single thread of DNA from a human cell contains information equivalent to a library of 1,000 volumes. Today, we know the human genome has up to 3 billion base pairs of DNA that influence the expression of traits in an individual cell. This isn't just some random clump of cells. Between 5 and 9 days after conception, the new person burrows into the womb's wall for safety and nourishment. Already his or her gender can be determined by scientific means. The gender, male or female, it's already determined just 5 to 9 days after conception. At just 18 days after conception, the heart is forming, eyes start to develop. By 21 days, the heart pumps blood throughout the whole body. By 28 days, the unborn baby has budding arms and legs. By 30 days, she has a brain and has multiplied in size 10,000 times. Now, you think 30 days, that's only 4 weeks. Most people don't even find out that they are pregnant till between 5 and 7 weeks. So at this stage, all this stuff is already happening before people even generally find out, or right as they're finding out that they are pregnant. It's not just a clump of cells. By 35 days, her mouth, ears, and nose are taking shape. At 40 days, the preborn child's brain waves can be recorded, and her heartbeat, which began 3 weeks earlier, can be detected by an ultrasonic stethoscope. By 42 days, her skeleton is formed and her brain is controlling movement of muscles and organs. By 8 weeks, hands and feet are almost perfectly formed. The 9-week baby has already perfected a somersault, backflip, and a scissors kick. The unborn child responds to stimulus and may already be capable of feeling pain. Now, there's debate on whether they can feel pain or not. No one actually knows when the baby can feel pain, but there is some indication that it might be as early as that 9-week mark. By 10 weeks, the child squints, swallows, and frowns. By 11 weeks, he urinates, makes a wide variety of facial expressions, and even smiles. By 12 weeks, the child is kicking, turning his feet, curling, and fanning his toes, making a fist, moving thumbs, bending wrists, and opening his mouth. All of this happens in the first trimester, which is the first 3 months of life. This is no mere clump of cells. This is a living, growing human being. The science is clear. This is what a clump of cells looks like. This is skin cells. It's a clump of cells pushed together here, and you can clearly see it's just a clump of cells, just random cells clumped together. This is an 8-week fetus. You can see this 8-week fetus here has arms, legs. You can see the eyes, the nose, the mouth. You can see the beginnings of ears. You can see the head. You can see little fingers. This is not just a clump of cells, and this is at 8 weeks. Remember, most women don't find out they're pregnant until 5 to 7 weeks. Most abortions don't happen as early as 8 weeks. You can clearly see that's not just a clump of cells. By the way, and we'll talk about this as we go in just a moment, but I want to point out, since I've got it on the screen, the word fetus, a lot of people try to say that fetus is something other than, it's not a human, it's not a baby, it's a fetus. The word fetus comes from the Latin word that literally just means offspring. It literally means child. Fetus just means child. It's just a word we use to describe a stage of human development. A toddler is not an adult, but it's still a human. A toddler is just a word we use to describe a stage of human development. The abortion industry actually knows this. They know that this isn't just a clump of cells. They know this is actually a human body, and they see it. After a fetus is aborted, they will actually go back and gather together the body parts and try to put the body back together to make sure they have all of the human body parts, arms, legs. I'm going to play a video clip for you, and I want to go ahead and tell you right off the bat, it is emotional. It's going to interview 2 women who worked in abortion clinics who talk about what they call the POC room, which is a room where after an abortion is done, they would go and gather up the parts of conception or the parts of the baby that they just aborted, and they would actually have to make sure all the parts are accounted for so they'd piece it back together. It's very disturbing. There is one image. It's disturbing in what they say. There is one image. It's not a real image. It's a cartoon image of a baby being aborted out of the womb. It is rough, so if this is going to be triggering to you, you can go ahead and skip this part and jump back in. But I think it's important to understand that the abortion industry, they know it's not a clump of cells. They lie to women. So let's see what they have to say.
So you described when you were first being trained at Planned Parenthood, they sent you to an actual abortion room to witness the procedure. Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, when you first start out, they have the trainee stand by the door. And I did that for the first 2 or 3 procedures, and I finally said, why does that happen? And she said, well, usually when somebody comes in for the first time, they pass out. And I didn't pass out. So after, I don't know, a few were done, they let me start moving closer so I could get to the foot of the bed and be able to see, you know, what was happening. But the whole procedure only takes just 3 or 4 minutes. And what they call the contents of uterus or products of conception are emptied into this gallon jar. And they turn it off and take this suction thing off the gallon jar and set it in the pass-through, and it goes into the dirty lab. So then you go around the corner and into the dirty lab, take the jar out, put it in this big, like a Rubbermaid colander, and rinse it with this big hose. Then you dump it in this little glass jar and put it on this little shelf that has this bright light. And you bring the light over it and you kind of piece it back together and try to see if you got all the parts. And I remember standing there looking at that, and I said, why are there 3 arms? You know, and we're looking, and the gal training me said, twins. It was twins. And I said, you know, do you tell the mom that she had twins? And she says, no, it usually just upsets them. Then, of course, this jar, this little glass bowl with this baby, depending on how far along the baby was, there's this big white porcelain sink, and they would dump it in there, rinse it, put the bowl back to use next time, and hit the plunger, and it would flush, kind of like a toilet. And I just remember standing there thinking, all those babies are in the Des Moines sewer system. In later time that I would be there, they were putting those babies in little red bags and with a twist tie, and then they'd fling them in the freezer. And I remember kind of thinking, I wonder what they do with those, because I thought if there's a buck to be made, they will sell those.
One of the things that you had shared in a previous interview, Marianne, was you spent some time working in the POC room. Can you share more about your experience in that room and what that room is?
POC stands for Products of Conception. In that room, the doctor, when he got through with the abortion procedure, he would walk in there with the dirty instruments in one hand that he had used for the procedure. And in his arm, he had a big jar about this tall, and he had it tucked in his arm like this. And he would come in there and he would lay down the dirty instruments at the sink, and he would take the jar that had the products of conception, as they called it. He would pour it into a giant sifter, kind of like what you would use like for flour. He would pour that out. He would sift through it with his hands, checking for the parts to make sure they were all there.
And you'd be standing there watching him doing this?
Yes. Sometimes I just couldn't take it. And I would run to the restroom or run out in the hallway maybe and get some supplies or something, just to step out of there for a little while he was sifting through that. There was one doctor that would sit there and he would sometimes talk to this, saying, I'll never forget him saying, now, where's your little arm? I didn't see I'm missing this arm. And he would sift through it, trying to find the pieces. And then he'd say, I remember him saying, oh, there you are. Now, where's the head? And where's this? There was another doctor that also visited, and he specifically asked for like an illuminary type light, and they bought it for him. And he would actually take the pieces of tissue, put them on this light, and put it back together.
Put the body parts back together.
Yes.
And you could see arms, legs, you could see.
Yes. And he really seemed to kind of get into it. I'll never forget the first day he was there, and he goes, look at this. This is so cool. You can see this and this. And I'm just like, that's okay. I'll pass.
And what would he say? He'd say, you can see this and this?
He would name the parts. Yes.
So he would say an arm, a leg.
Yes. Look, you could even see tiny little blood vessels in there.
So he could identify there were actual
Yes.
discernible parts that he would be putting together.
At 13 weeks, 6 days, you can. Yeah.
I highlight that to show that the abortion industry knows that this is not just a clump of cells. They have blood vessels and arms and legs. This is something they know, but they lie to so many women, and they won't show the women. They won't tell the women what just happened. They let the women believe it's just a clump of cells, and they try to pretend that they didn't just kill an innocent human life. So really, the question goes to, when does life begin? Some people try to argue life doesn't begin at conception. So before that, even though there's arms and legs, maybe it's not alive. It's not a human life. But that actually flies in the face of science. Keith L. Moore is a world-renowned embryologist, and he's actually written many books on embryology, and medical students actually study from his textbooks that he's written. He is a world-renowned scientist. This is not just some random guy. And this is what he said. He said, the zygote, now the zygote is the earliest stage of human development right after conception. The egg is fertilized by the sperm, and now we have a zygote. The zygote, formed by the union of an octite, I might be butchering the pronunciation of that, but that's an unfertilized egg from a woman, and a sperm is the beginning of a new human being. He wrote that in Before We Were Born, Essentials of Embryology. It was a book, a textbook that he wrote. When does life begin? Well, according to the textbook Human Embryology and Teratology, it says, fertilization is an important landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human organism is formed. Genetically distinct human organism. That fertilization is the beginning of it. It's the start of it. It is formed at fertilization, at conception, a new distinct human organism. Dr. Michelle M. Matthews Roth of Harvard Medical School gave confirming testimony supported by references from over 20 embryology and other medical textbooks that human life began at fertilization. This is what Dr. Micheline said. It is incorrect to say that biological data cannot be decisive. It is scientifically correct to say that an individual human life begins at conception. Father of modern genetics, Dr. Jerome Lejeune, told lawmakers this: to accept the fact that after fertilization has taken place, a new human has come into being is no longer a matter of taste or opinion. It is plain experimental evidence. Each individual has a very neat beginning at conception. Again, life begins at conception. This is the father of modern genetics. This isn't just some random person. Science has proven that life begins at conception. Dr. McCarthy Demir, a medical doctor and law professor at University of Tennessee, testified that the exact moment of the beginning of personhood and of the human body is at the moment of conception. It's very interesting. He explicitly says personhood. He's a medical doctor. Why did he say personhood? Some people argue, okay, maybe it's alive, but it's not technically a person until they're born. But that's not actually true. Every way that we determine personhood scientifically, every measure is met at conception. So no, absolutely, from the moment of conception, it is a person. Science clearly shows us this. Dr. Alfred Bongiovanni says, he's a professor of pediatrics and obstetrics. He says, I am no more prepared to say that these early stages represent an incomplete human being than I would be to say that a child prior to the dramatic effects of puberty is not a human being. I have learned from my earliest medical education that human life begins at the time of conception. Dr. Richard V. Janes says, to say that the beginning of human life cannot be determined scientifically is utterly ridiculous. Some people try to argue, well, we don't exactly know when life begins. Well, first of all, that's a terrible argument, because if you don't know, then to risk putting a innocent life to death simply because you don't know when it begins would be dangerous. You would then, in that case, still say we can't commit abortion after conception because we don't want to risk, since we don't know. But the truth is, we do know. It does say, science does clearly say, human life starts at conception. Dr. Landrum Shettles, who's sometimes called the father of in vitro fertilization, notes that conception confers life and makes that life one of a kind. That it is conception that brings about life, and that life is one of a kind from conception. And this is the father of in vitro fertilization. Gordon Jaime, a medical doctor and chairman of medical genetics at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, said, by all criteria of modern molecular biology, life is present from the moment of conception. Science has a very simple conception of man. As soon as he has been conceived, a man is a man. In other words, it doesn't matter, and when he says man here, he's talking about human being. It doesn't matter if it looks like a human being in that very early stage. What matters is that all of science clearly shows it is a human being. Life begins at conception. Christopher Hook, an oncologist at Mayo Clinic and director of ethics education, he says, when fertilization is complete, a unique genetic human entity exists. Life is present at conception. Even the American College of Pediatrics has this on their website. When human life begins, they say, the predominance of human biological research confirms that human life begins at conception, at fertilization. At fertilization, evolution, the human being emerges as a whole, genetically distinct, individuated, zygotic living human organism, a member of the species of Homo sapiens, needing only the proper environment in order to grow and develop. The difference between the individual in its adult stage and in its zygotic stage is just one of form, not nature. This statement focuses on the scientific evidence of when individual human life begins. It begins at conception. Now, a lot of people are actually starting to acknowledge this who are pro-abortion, but there's many people who still have bought into that lie that human life hasn't begun, that they're not killing a human life. It's just a bunch of cells. Now, this leads us to another argument. Some people acknowledge that yes, it's a human life, but it hasn't reached the age of viability yet. And if it's not viable, then it really isn't wrong to abort the child because it's not viable outside of the mother's womb. This is the argument from viability. There's a couple of problems with this argument. Number one, viability changes. Technology changes viability. 100 years ago, a baby born before 35 weeks would not be considered viable. Now, the age of viability is 24 weeks. 100 years from now, it could be even less. And so here's the thing. Technology gives us the ability to keep babies alive when they're born early. So what was viable before and what is viable now are different. And what can be viable in the future can be different. So if you're saying it's okay to kill it because it can't live outside the womb, you're saying that it's okay because it's just dependent upon technology. Since when did biology become dependent on technology? Another issue is if you're defining viability as simply the ability to survive outside the womb on its own outside the womb, well, a 2-year-old can't survive alone either. If viability is the ability to survive outside the womb, then a 2-year-old is not viable because outside intervention for that 2-year-old will die outside the womb as well. It still needs intervention. Just because it's not inside the womb doesn't mean that it doesn't need intervention. And another issue is killing an innocent human life is wrong regardless. Just because a life needs assistance doesn't make it any less of a life. You don't get to kill an innocent life just because they need care to stay alive. As a matter of fact, arguing this argument almost becomes even more immoral. You're already arguing to kill innocent life, but now you're arguing I can kill innocent life because I don't want to have to care or use my body to care for that innocent life. You're saying that because they're vulnerable, you can kill it. That is absolutely horrific. So no, viability is not a legitimate argument for why abortion should be allowed. Then there's a couple of throwaway arguments here that I call them throwaway arguments because they're really just an attempt to attack people who are pro-life. So for example, they'll say if you're pro-life, then why do you support the death penalty? Which is absolutely a ridiculous argument because it's not addressing the actual issue of killing that innocent baby in the womb. It's just trying to attack the people who are supporting pro-life. But there's a simple answer. Abortion is the killing of an innocent life. Being pro-life is about being against the killing of an innocent life. It does not speak to the issue of death penalty or war. The death penalty is not killing an innocent life. And if you talk about the context of war, it kind of falls in that same category. It's not just going up and willfully killing an innocent life who's done nothing. Kind of along the same lines, they'll say if you're pro-life, then why do you support the Second Amendment? People are killed and murdered by guns all the time. So why do you support guns? Well, first of all, supporting the Second Amendment and supporting guns does not equal supporting murder with the guns. Nobody who is a pro-Second Amendment advocate is arguing that murder with guns is okay. Aside from that, abortion is the killing of an innocent life. Being pro-life is about being against the killing of an innocent life. The Second Amendment does not give you a right to kill an innocent person. It protects your right to self-defense. And self-defense does not kill an innocent person. Therefore, pro-life does not speak to the issue. Again, if someone is harming me and I use a gun to shoot that person in self-defense, that is not taking an innocent life by definition. It is me stopping someone who is clearly not innocent because they are attacking me. So therefore, it's not an issue about pro-life. Another argument that people will make against people who are pro-life is they'll say they're not pro-life, they're just pro-birth. After the baby's born, they don't care about that baby. Now, usually when people make this argument, what they're trying to really argue is about socialism and social frameworks and like government-run healthcare and government assistance. And they're saying if you really cared about people after they're born, you'd want to take care of the poor by having more welfare and more things like that. Now, the problem with that argument is we agree that the poor should be taken care of. We don't necessarily agree in how that's done. Just because we don't agree that the government should be the ones taking care of the poor or that the government's social networks actually do help the poor, just because we have disagreements there does not mean that we don't care about taking care of the poor. So it's first right off the bat, it's just an argument that is another throwaway argument. It's just an attack. But to address that, first of all, your right to life does not grant you a right to be provided for by the government. government. I can stand up against someone killing you and not have to think the government should provide for you, right? So you have a right to life. That means that people cannot just kill you. That does not mean that because you have a right to life, the government should just take care of you. Those are not the same thing. You can't compare those two things. So number one, again, a right to life is not a right for the government to provide for you. Number two, 8 out of the top 10 states in giving to charity are conservative red states that are predominantly pro-life. Here they are. In Alabama, Utah, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, North Carolina, Arizona, Maryland. Now, before you say, well, wait, Georgia voted Democrat in this last election. Yes, but our governor and everything in Georgia is indeed a Republican. So currently, Georgia's still a Republican state, a red state. Now, looking at these states, 8 of the top 10 states that give to charity, which goes to helping people, 8 out of 10 of them are red pro-life states. Matter of fact, several of these states have strong abortion laws. Now, that being said, if you look a little deeper into this, yes, New Jersey and Minnesota are there. This is ranked in order of percentage of itemizers that donated to charity. And you can see that New Jersey and Minnesota, 84% gave. But I want you to look, Maryland, only 83% donated to charity compared to the 84 in Minnesota and New Jersey. But look at the amounts donated. 83% of itemizers donated to charity, but Maryland actually donated more than Minnesota and New Jersey. So even though they're ranked below Minnesota and New Jersey, technically they are actually higher than. As a matter of fact, Minnesota and New Jersey, the two Democrat states here, they are actually number 9 and 10 when it comes into ranking of a dollar amount given. So you can see that very clearly. So again, saying that we don't care about people after they're born is simply a lie. Are we just pro-birth? Well, not according to this. This is actually from back in 2008, so this is a little dated, but you can see here clearly it says donated money to charity. When you look at who donated money on the left-hand side of this chart to charity, 54% of Republicans compared to 45% of Democrats. When you compare that to volunteered, it's not just donating money, it's putting our money where our mouth is. It's not just giving money, we are going and actually putting feet and action to this. 33% of Republicans volunteered for a cause compared to 24% of Democrats. So again, saying that we don't care about the life after it's born is simply a lie. We do care about the life after it's born. We take care of the life after it's born. We just don't agree that the government is the one to take care of them. We actually put our money where our mouth is and we do it. We take care of it. So to say that we're just pro-birth, simply a lie. To go further, the Family Research Council explained in the Washington Post the amount of money overtly religious organizations spend on healthcare, education, and anti-poverty programs dwarfs what they spend on social issues like fighting abortion and exceeds or rivals what non-religious foundations and the federal government spend on such programs. In other words, what it's saying is that religious organizations, we don't just spend all our time focused on just abortion, although that's a huge issue that we absolutely should focus on. But religious organizations don't just focus on those things. They go deeper. They give to education, healthcare, anti-poverty programs, and that number dwarfs the amount they spend on social causes like abortion. It goes further than that. And this is according to the Washington Post, or according to the Family Research Council, explained in the Washington Post. They reported. So let's look at the numbers. They cited a roundtable report showing that in 2009, American churches donated more than $13 billion to overseas relief and development efforts. $13 billion. Compare that to $5 billion spent or sent abroad by foundations in the same year that were not religious foundations. $5 billion compared to $13 billion from churches alone, not counting church organizations. $6 billion from private and voluntary relief organizations apart from church support. $6 billion compared to the church's $13 billion. What about $9 billion donated internationally by corporations, dwarfed by the $13 billion from churches? It doesn't compare. Ultimately, when you deal with the science, when you deal with how viability doesn't work, when you deal with the fact that there's no constitutional right to an abortion, it comes down to one ultimate question. One ultimate question. Is killing an innocent life acceptable? That's all it comes down to. We can address the constitutional right and prove how there is no constitutional right to an abortion. We can address all of these different pieces of arguments. We can address the science. We can address all these things, and it ultimately will come down to one thing. Is killing an innocent life acceptable? You either think that it is, showing you are immoral, or you think that it's not. That's it. That's your options. It comes down to nothing else. And that ends our video for today. Now, if you are someone who is in need of assistance, that you're thinking about having an abortion, there is information available for you. There is help for you. Do not feel you have to do this alone. In the description box below, there will be information that you can reach out and find help. Also, if you've had an abortion and you're struggling with the effects of that and you're hurting after the decision decision you made, there is grace for you and there is help. Reach out in the description box below. There is help for you. That being said, I am so glad you joined me today. If you liked this video, if you got help out of this video, if this provided value to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Comment down below with information, your thoughts, your opinions, any facts or details that I may have left out that you think are important. Comment that down below. Thank you so much for joining us. Till next time. Thanks so much for watching. For more videos, click subscribe and hit that notification bell. And if you enjoyed the video, click that like button. See you next time.